Okay, we are recording. I am Brandon Polite, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois, and I'm joined by Tom Cochrane, who is Senior Lecturer in Philosophy at Flinders University in Adelaide, Australia. Tom, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a great series you have.
Thank you. So I've been looking forward to this for a while, in a sense, for a very long while, because you and I are sort of part of this philosophical thing that starts with you writing this paper called Joint Attention to Music, which came out in the British Journal of Aesthetics, I think in 2009. Um,
Right.
and
And
then,
that paper originally was part of my PhD. So I actually wrote it 2006 or so.
wow, okay, so there's a good lineage here. And then a couple of years later, Nick Zangwell writes a response to that called Listening to Music Together. And
Right.
then several years after that, I wrote a response to Nick's paper called Shared Musical Experiences, also in the British Journal of Aesthetics. And so you and I, in a sense, have sort of teamed up against Nick Zangwell.
Right. I mean, Nick is my philosophical bête noire. He's the person who I often disagree with on, particularly about music. He has quite a radical position on things like that.
Absolutely. And so your paper, which sort of kicks off this relationship that we now have, you argue about, the fact that music is something we can jointly attend to, right? That joint attention to music is possible, and you go through the process of how we can attend to music's aesthetic properties as objects of joint attention. Nick Zangwill, of course, disagrees with that, argues that joint attention to aesthetic properties of any sort is impossible. And then I come in to argue that no, Nick has it wrong. Joint attention to aesthetic properties of any sort, including musical ones, is very much possible and is sort of a common feature of listening to music alongside with others. And so, how about you jump in and say some stuff, and then I'll respond to you.
I mean, when I started out on that issue, I was thinking of it in a much more simplistic way than it was then taken by Nick and you. I was just interested in the social experience of music, just assuming, yeah, this is obvious that this is something people do, and it's different from when we listen to music on our own. And then Nick says, "Oh no, but you haven't really thought about the nature of aesthetic properties properly. There's all this complexity about how aesthetic properties are different from regular perceptual properties in the world, and actually." The role of pleasure in making an aesthetic property what it is means that you can't share this thing. It's entirely private because our pleasures are private. This had not occurred to me at all. This was completely off my radar when I wrote that paper. So I was very happy that Nick responded, and there was a bit of a debate starting up. And then, yes, you came along and you said, no, it's quite possible, correct me if I'm wrong, that even though pleasure is involved perhaps in perceiving these properties of the music, that doesn't mean it's the pleasure kind of is the thing that you're perceiving. It's just part of the process of accessing these properties. And that seems basically right to me. That seems a way to allow the aesthetic properties are, yeah, they're more complex than regular perceptual properties, but still something that just routinely we point to. And I think even when you think about the basic nature of joint attention, it's not just, oh, here's a thing, here's another thing, isn't that nice? It's about appreciating things together, even in the earliest like infant caregiver scenarios. So I think when we think in a more deep way about the nature of joint attention, it doesn't become such a problem to say that these things can be genuinely enjoyed together.
Yeah, and I'm totally on board with that. And you reconstructed my view correctly. It's even if pleasure is involved, and maybe it is, maybe it's not. I think in the paper I just grant that, sure, Nick may be right about this, but even if it is, we're not attending to the pleasure. The pleasure is helping to facilitate access to things, to properties in the music that we then jointly attend to, right? Just like, your experience of the spiciness of the curry may not be on the same level as mine, but we're still attending to the spiciness of the thing, even if you experience it less intensely than I do.
Right. And I think both of us were interested in the idea that we can jointly approach these things and it can be a collaborative process to engage with something. So that even though there might be differences, we help each other to notice certain things, or certain things take on a meaning that they wouldn't otherwise have if we were just on our own. So I started out thinking about emotions, particularly when I was focusing on music listening, because that was just part of the PhD project at the time, that I was interested in how people use music to share emotional states. Thinking of quite striking and crazy experiences people report of, like, feeling like they're in a joint mind. And listening to music together seemed to be approaching that. That people really feel, oh wow, there's something we're all doing here. We're all focusing on this thing that has this intense emotional content. And that seemed to be a really significant thing that, part of human society. You then were also interested in other kinds of aesthetic properties, right?
Yeah, beyond the emotional. So yeah, the spiciness of the curry, or the hauntingness of the blues song, or yeah. So expressive properties in addition to emotional states.
Yeah, and that's, I think, part of the point of appreciation of art. Far too often we think of it as, the individual just engaging with something. But I don't think the practice of appreciating something would even exist if it wasn't within this broader social context. That it's a way of engaging with the world that isn't in general an individualistic one at root. It's one that is getting a bit outside of your individual relations with the world. Do you see what I'm getting at there?
Oh, I think that's absolutely right. That that individual valuing isn't, I don't think, even possible without sort of the collective forms of valuing that we're involved in from birth, essentially. Right, that this is something where we're sort of trained culturally, socially, to do together with others, and then we sort of carve out our own individual sort of sensibilities from the larger project that we're a part of with others.
Yeah, I mean, I was very impressed when I was reading the infant joint attention literature that they were using examples like, oh, isn't this thing funny? Or isn't this thing scary? Or isn't this thing interesting? That objects were starting to take on significance in these joint attention scenarios. We're like looking at the thing and going, wow, look at this. Isn't this cool, right? And it's a way that we're starting to tune in to a social world at that point. Just when we're like 9 months to 1 year old, we're just trying to tune into what other people care about, and it's accordingly what we start to care about. So much of the way we perceive the world is value laden. We don't just perceive things in a random way, or just in a way that doesn't consider their purpose. It's always about, what can this thing do for me, or what can this thing do for us? And that's what gives it its kind of richness and significance.
Yeah, and I think in your book, The Aesthetic Value of the World, which came out in 2021 from
Yeah.
Oxford University Press, I think you mentioned that point with respect, when you're talking about joint attention, that our first sense of objective reality, of there being a world outside of us, is sort of intersubjective, right? It's through those sort of infant caregiver relationship of sort of the infant tracking what the caregiver is doing and what they're attending to is, oh, there's something out there beyond me, right? That we sort of break out of whatever form of solipsism we're dealing with.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a bit tentative about how profound that point should be. I mean, in certain moods, I want to say that yes, aesthetics is right there at the roots of our sense of the objective world. I'm not sure how much I can really nail that point down, but I find it very, very interesting to consider. And certainly, when I was trying to find, a big idea to connect various thoughts about aesthetics, it did seem to me that the way that when we value things aesthetically, we get beyond ourselves and into this world that's beyond our own egoistic concerns. That seemed to me like a really core point. And this idea, of aesthetically valuing the world, that it's not just about me consuming things or owning things or improving my status. It's about appreciating this thing out here for its own sake. And so that's something that we can all do together. And it's one of the distinctive features of aesthetic value, that we can all appreciate this thing together. So, I start thinking in my head, it wasn't that culture invented aesthetic value. Aesthetic value invented culture. It was the very thing that allows us to create sociality or socialness. What's the word? I don't know. In the first place. Yeah, we can all go, hey, everyone, there's this thing out here. We can all value it and we can all appreciate it and celebrate it. And that gives us a foundation for, a genuine community, rather than merely, me exchanging something with you for my own personal benefit, and hopefully you get some benefit as well. It's like a real social joy, if you like.
Yeah. It's something we do together. And so in your view, right? So in the book, you talk about sort of our valuing practices. And so how do you think that individual valuing is different from joint valuing or collective or shared valuing, this sort of thing that we do together versus when we do it privately?
Right. So in the moment of appreciating something, I think that the lesson we take from the joint attention literature is that we approach this thing together. And the way I conceive it is that the other people in that scenario are like a filter on your perception. So you're always kind of thinking through your idea of what they are thinking. Even spatially speaking, you have a sense, okay, I can see this angle of the thing, but you can see that angle. So I'm already having a wider sense of the object than I might have in the visual case than when I was looking at it individually. And similarly, there's going to be all these sense of what's normal and, certain pressures, social pressures about how this thing is supposed to be treated in a normal way. And, what counts as relevant to this group about that object. So if we're at a concert and we're all clapping at the music, then presumably, yes, we all like this thing. And if I didn't like it, I'd be like, I'm constrained, I'm inhibited to be really fully myself in that situation. But on the positive side, if I'm enjoying this thing and I can see that you're also enjoying that thing, then that really gives me a sense of reinforcement and solidarity, and a sense of its intensified meaning, right? That this thing doesn't just, it's not just good for me, but it's good for all of us, and that validates my view, I guess, and helps me to feel, oh, I'm doing something with other people here that matters.
Yeah, it matters, and I'm doing it right. Like I'm appreciating, I'm valuing this thing in the right way, right? And yeah, I mean, you're right that that does amplify the experience. It intensifies whatever emotional state you're in, the pleasure state that you're in, and it's something that you're doing together, right? That presumably most people in the concert hall or arena are like vibing with you, in that way, and you're sort of feeding off of each other's enthusiasm, when it's going well.
Right. I mean, one of the contrasts I make in that paper is between the silent listening situation and the noisy listening situation. I think in the silent case, that's typical to a classical concert. There's a real intensity, like, you know, this thing is like a tightrope act that could just collapse at any second, and there's a real tension to that. I can't really express it any better. And in the noisy case, it's just like a roar that lifts everyone up, so that, you know, everything becomes super intense. There's that nice quote, the girl going to the Prince concert, right? And he just has to say hello and everyone just goes completely wild. Yes, there's lots of nice descriptions of that kind in this space. So I thought I'd like to show you something, so that, you know, rather than talking at a purely abstract level about this, we can try to get into the details of how this works, because I think once we look at the details, we can think, okay, is this really working the way that these philosophers are making out? So there's this piece by Tchaikovsky. It's from a set of 12 piano pieces called The Seasons. And this is the one for June. It's called Barcarolle. And it's very beautiful, but I wonder if we can listen to this together, whether you can pick up on the features in the same way that I do. So this is our little experiment in joint attention to music. I'll have a go. I might blow it, so be patient with me. So, not a perfect performance, but there's a particular bit in it that I want to point to, and that's this second long phrase where it goes. So we got this nice chord here. So here we're in B flat major. So everything is feeling quite nice at this point. And then it's this particular chord that really gets me. Sorry, I should do the E flat. And then it resolves back onto G minor. It's just this. There's something about that just hits me so strong. There's a recording I think we're going to link on YouTube by Richter, great pianist. And of all the performances I've heard, his one just really nails that chord so precisely. I mean, I'm not a concert pianist, so I can't quite do it as well as he does. But there's just a way that he just captures that note very slightly. It's I don't know how to describe it. It's like you have a flower in your hand and you just crush it a little bit, right? So you can feel its soft petals and then you just crush it. And that flower is my soul, right? It's just taking that very delicate thing and just pushing it or applying pressure to it. And so I've become very sensitized to it, so that I listen always, and I can repeat it over and over and over, and I hear that kind of the way he just very subtly presses on that chord. And it just, I mean, I've played lots of chords, you know, thousands upon thousands I've heard many different kinds of chord changes, and that one just particularly for some reason gets me. So I just wondered if you can hear what I'm talking about when I refer to that. Like, does that make sense to you, what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there is, there's a dissonance to it. There's this sort of sadness to it, but it's not,
Right.
like sappy sadness or something. It's
Right. I mean, you've got that direct sensory roughness there. That's just an objective property of the sound that you can't escape that. But then it's the way it resolves too. It resolves to this this flat 5, and it's important to recognize that there are many ways he could have gone at that point. Right? He's just gone up to B flat major. He could have gone into like a major tonality more. It's hovering right on the brink. He could have gone. And it would have been sappy and unpleasant, right? Or he could have gone into a more minor direction. Like he could have gone. He could have resolved it like that. But instead he takes it in a more intense direction, so that you wouldn't predict it when you were first listening. It's certainly somewhat unusual, but it has that nice sense of being, when you hear it, it's like, oh yeah, that's exactly how it had to be. Like that was the route that made sense of everything else that came before it. It brought it to a certain height. But I'm not sure that you'll feel it in the same way that I do. I don't know. You have to kind of tell me how it works for you.
Yeah, I need to dig more into Tchaikovsky, but I think you're absolutely right. And, as you're describing it, it reminds me of, David Huron's work in sort of the psychology of music listening, with classical music in particular, of setting up expectations and then violating those as a way of generating an emotional response. And, Tchaikovsky could have gone sort of the sappy major route, or the sappier minor route. And yet he sort of threads that needle and hits the unexpected, slightly dissonant, and yet perfect, given the context, chord that then sort of establishes that works perfectly with what came before it, and then sort of establishes what comes after it.
Yeah. I mean, all that stuff that Huron talks about, how we're constantly anticipating how the music is going to develop, and then we're bringing our attention to a certain point as it comes, and then you'll get a certain release as the results come. Maybe there's an initial sense of pleasure, like if you got it right, but I think in this case, more important is the sense that there was hope as the thing started to open out, and then he crushes it again. So there's a sense of almost like disappointment, I suppose, but it's just heartbreaking. That's the best way I can put it. I mean, I know that you're not like a big classical fan. You're more into Taylor Swift and this stuff, right? So that's not stuff that I know particularly well at all. And even here, it's like the piano means something else to me, that because it's something I also play myself, that when I hear someone playing, I can have a sense of what it would be like to press those keys down. I can have a sense of the pressure involved, and also how hard it is. I mean, that's a hard chord to get your fingers around, because it's like 4 notes and your hand's sort of twisted a bit like that. That's why I was kind of having a bit of trouble with it when I was playing. So there's real tension and also pressure involved physically that you're imagining when you hear it. So I mean, I can show you all those details, and you play the guitar, right? So you'll have a different sense of what that's like to listen to. And I won't necessarily pick up on the features of the guitar that you pick up on. So it does raise this worry that there is something quite individually variable about our appreciation, and I'm not certain that we can be sure that we're talking about the same thing.
Yeah.
So I wondered if you have a view on how that can be overcome or how it can be reconciled.
Yeah, I mean, so when, in the shared musical experiences paper, what I talk about is, there's this ebb and flow of, the jointness of our attention, that there are certain moments when we are locked on the exact same property. And then there are moments where we're attending to different things, and yet, occasionally over the course of the piece of music, we're going to join up enough, that presumably we're feeling roughly the same mood of the piece, even if it's not precise, exact, that there's going to be some.
How would you describe the mood then exactly of that piece?
That's a really good question, right? And so, I mean, there's a somberness to it. There's a joyfulness to it, oddly, that I feel is sort of under it. And yeah, I don't know. Do you feel the somberness, the joyful?
I don't. I certainly get the ambiguity that it's a minor tonality, so classically that's a sad sounding tonality, at least to Western enculturated listeners. It raised that whole question, that classic issue of it's not too imprecise to put into words, but precisely, it's too precise to put into words. It's too specific that words can't quite capture it. But I think I was thinking about this yesterday, and I thought to myself that it's the sense of tenderness that really gets to me. So it's not quite sadness; it's just a kind of human tenderness, a sort of receptivity to harm and joy, and all the variations and delicate shades of feeling. So it really does convey a human quality that I find very attractive. So I'm not sure if I'm thinking about a particular person, or maybe I'm thinking about Richter when he plays it, or Tchaikovsky, or someone like that. I don't know, but I'm thinking about a specific kind of human character that's a sort of sensitive person, I guess. And I'm enjoying that person, and I'm sympathizing with that person. And that person seems to me like a lovable person, if I can put it in that way. The kind of person who goes out into nature and goes, oh, it's a flower, or enjoys the stars in the sky, and then maybe comes home and plays the piano a bit or something, right? So that I find very interesting as well, the idea that when we appreciate things aesthetically, we're also creating, in some sense, ideals. We're saying, okay, this is a way in which you can feel. This is a way in which you can go out into the world. This is a way in which things could be. And having those in front of us in our society, I think, is a really important role that art supplies. It gives us these models of virtue that help to cultivate our sensibilities the more and more we engage with them. So yeah, listen to this music, and you'll become a more sensitive soul, or at least you'll have a sense of what that's like, what it's like to be that kind of person, and maybe that will influence you a little bit. But at least it'll be something you can go, yeah, that's a good thing.
Yeah, there's a sense of I'm glad this exists in the world. Right.
I'm glad Tchaikovsky exists. I mean, and that's 150 years ago, right? And I'm glad Richter exists, and everything about it is a way of endorsing humanity. So, and I think that's kind of interesting in that it's a different way of relating to other humans than we would normally relate to someone in an interpersonal situation. I mean, I relate to my loved ones in a certain kind of way that's very wrapped up with my own personal projects and their projects, and, you know, can we succeed together? Are we having a good time together? But here it's a much more kind of objective sense of a person. Here is a lovable person that I don't have to have any particular relationship with that person. They don't need to serve me. I'm not serving them. And yet I recognize their value. And it's the kind of value that we can also get for all sorts of different things in the world. So for me, it always keeps coming back to this claim that I'm overcoming my own kind of egoistic concerns, and I'm starting to appreciate the world in this different way, where I go, this is a lovable thing, or this is a lovable person. And so I've been very interested in trying to figure out, like, what is going on there. Like, why do we value things in this way? You know, what is it even to value things in this way? How does it connect to the more practical ways in which we value things? Which for me, hopefully, would, you know, open up aesthetics to the rest of reality, or show how, you know, aesthetics has a place within a wider psychology or a wider kind of social understanding.
Okay, yeah. So in your view, our aesthetic values are distal versions of practical values. So could you say more about what that means?
Right. So I think this is my big idea for aesthetics, that when you look at all the aesthetic values and you try to tabulate them and see what they all have in common, you start to see that you can connect them to our various practical drives. So in the research I've done on emotions and the whole development of our kind of concern or value-based psychology, you see that there's a finite number of basic drives that we have, and each one seems to have a way in which it can be stimulated from a distance. So to start with a simple example, we have this basic drive for food, and there's, for very, very good practical reasons, we need this to survive. And then on top of that, we also have this capacity to enjoy taste, and that's a way of getting reward from food prior to actually ingesting it. So you get a nutritional value from absorbing the food, but you also get this reward before you've even consumed it. So you can also get it when you smell the food. So similarly, you can look at the other aesthetic values along these lines. So where I was particularly first impressed by this idea was with the category of the sublime. So, you know, mountains and volcanoes and storms and this kind of stuff. It seemed to me that part of the enjoyment of sublime things is to get that sense of power, right? But you're not personally powerful. You haven't acquired any particular power by looking at this volcano. And yet, when you really concentrate on its qualities and you start to imaginatively engage with it and start to imagine what those qualities are like exactly, you get this thrilling sense of, oh yeah, that feels really powerful and that feels good. So it seemed to me that that's, again, a distal version of a practical drive that we have for power. So similarly in the case of sympathy, so we have this practical drive to relate to others and to form loving relationships with others. And then we can engage with narratives or engage with people aesthetically and go, oh yeah, that's a sympathetic person. It's like from a distance, I can appreciate or get reward from that person without establishing any particular relationship with them. So it's the kind of claim that I could only come to having looked at all the different aesthetic values and saying, okay, can I make this work? Can I create a correspondence for each one? You know, you get that worry when you try to construct these sorts of theories that, you know, you have to kind of manipulate things in order to fit it into your box. But as far as I can tell, it does seem to work pretty neatly that for every aesthetic value, you can find some practical value that it connects with. And if that's right, I think that's a pretty significant finding, that we can explain why we have the aesthetic values, because in each case, there are ways to orient you towards potential sources of practical value. So, if you can get reward from a sympathetic looking person, you're already kind of inclined to engage further with that person and maybe then go on to establish a practical relationship. Or similarly, if you're the kind of person who's really turned on by power and gets really excited by that, your orientation towards sources of power is going to be your motivation to acquire that more practically. So yeah, I think appreciating the tenderness of the music similarly gives us that sympathetic value, and you get a sense of what that's like, and you become oriented towards it, and you start to notice it perhaps more in the world. So in terms of giving an evolutionary rationale for aesthetics, I think that's quite a satisfying answer.
Awesome. And it's interesting that music, right, that sound is able to elicit a sympathetic response in us when, it makes sense for sort of fictional characters to do that because they're very much like us. But music is just sound, as some people will say, and it's really baffling how sound would be able to do this to us. And yet, as you described the Tchaikovsky piece you played, you described it as very much like a person, and a sympathetic person whose tenderness you're attracted to.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it requires a bit of work on our part to make that connection. I dare say that, some other creature might not make such a direct association between how the sound moves or the chordal texture works and an emotional effect. Nevertheless, I mean, there are genuine resemblances between the way that music sounds and the way that emotions feel. So it is quite natural for us to make those sorts of connections. And of course, knowing that it's produced by a human for other humans helps to justify making that sort of connection as well. And what's always interested me is the way that the abstraction of the music seems to help. So I don't know if you're fully on this wavelength because you listen to a lot of vocal music, but for me, I prefer non-vocal music, partly because it allows me to kind of relate that to any situation. But I'm not, words can make things specific in a way that could be a barrier. That they're trying to pin it down too closely, and maybe the words are nonsense, and I don't agree with the words, right? But when it's just the sound and it's just the movements themselves, I think it's much easier for me to kind of connect it with who I am or just who anyone is. Yeah, I feel like I'm getting just to the kind of core dynamics of the emotion itself and not worrying too much about the particular situation happens to be. Of course, I can imagine a particular situation if there's something going on for me right now, but I don't have to. I have that flexibility.
Yeah, and that process is something you can do on your own, right? But you could also do it with others, right? By talking about the piece of music with others and listening to the piece of music with others, either on a recording or going to a concert and hearing a performance of it.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, that takes us back to what we talked about before, that this can be a collaborative process in which we figure out what this thing means to us. But I mean, although I do emphasize the social nature of music, I do want to say this thing is something you can do on your own. Of course you can, right? It's just a part of the justification, and the point of it is within this wider social context. Similarly, the fact that aesthetic values might orient us towards practical sources of value don't mean that you have to go out then and get the practical value, right? Or, you could be tricked. That really sympathetic looking person could end up stabbing you, right? You're tricked by it. Nevertheless, you were able to take the reward from it independently of the practical effects. And so that makes the world a source of value for you in a way that it wasn't before you were tuned in aesthetically to things.
Yeah, right. And similarly, you can really enjoy that bit of food, even though it has no nutritional value, right? It's been scientifically designed to give you all the aesthetic value with no nutrition whatsoever.
Yeah. You remember that, is it Steven Pinker's phrase that music is auditory cheesecake?
Yeah.
It's just the way it's constructed to really hit, like a super stimuli on our senses. it's a nice phrase, but the way he used it was to signify that music was useless, right? I don't know. I think cheesecake's pretty useful.
It's deeply useful. And we need more of it in the world. Cool.
Right.
Is there anything else you want to talk about?
I don't know. What do you want to talk about? We could talk more about music, um, but I think the core points for me is the way that music is able to capture a feeling, that we can tune into it together, that you can know what I'm talking about when I refer to it, and I can kind of show you and go, hey, what about this chord? That then connects to my capacity to overcome my own individual personal connection with things, and to start looking at things from a more objective point of view, and that has a big cultural significance, and in fact could be the foundation of our culture.
Yeah, I love that. So, Tom, thank you so much for joining me. This was a really fun discussion.
Thank you.